Okay, welcome back to CE 528. We were discussing in the last class, we were talking about how the gas tax, the traditional way that we have funded transportation infrastructure, is really becoming not enough for us to fund our infrastructure. You know, we have infrastructure need, but our gas tax revenue hasn't kept up. So we have to think about, okay, what other options do we have to fund the infrastructure? And then we are also focused, we've talked about that over time in this course, but in this module, I'm specifically focusing on what are the equity implications of those funding mechanisms that you might be interested in. So I'm going ahead and sharing my screen here. So we are discussing what options do we have, transportation funding options and their equity impacts. And I'll make these slides available as well as the video recording of this. So example options for funding, they include increasing motor fuel taxes and other existing federal use fees. So, you know, that's always on the agenda. You can always raise the fuel taxes. I mean, always means very loosely, I'm trying to use this term because it's a political hot potato, especially at this time where the fuel prices are in fact high. And at that time, it's very hard to increase the fuel taxes. It's a very problematic politically, but that's an option, right? If you want to increase it. Allowing state and metro areas to toll existing general purpose interstate highways. So that's on the table. And then some states have in fact done that. And then instituting mileage-based user fees to interstate use to replace other user fees. So, you know, just how much mileage you drive. We have the technology to track vehicles. We can potentially drive it. But again, there are privacy concerns that come in. And then other funding options, dedication of more existing federal aid to the interstates. Continuing the existing with general fund transfer, so basically taking the money, not from the highway fund, that fund the grant, but just basically overall tax revenues of the federal government and using that. And then applying carbon tax or cap and trade fees in part of the highway funding as a potential future strategy. So that could be another one. Now you could see that there is a dividing line, but the top three options are basically the user fees space. And then the bottom three are sort of more other types of funding options that don't directly come from the users. Road pricing, you know, here are some examples. We've talked about this, but they are direct charges for the use of roads. So they lead to that horizontal equity that we talked about. And they can be used as a tool to reduce congestion. We've talked about this. That's the marginal cost pricing that we discussed a few modules ago. But you could do it in a lot of different ways. So there is cordon pricing, area pricing. So this is what they're talking about in New York City. Fleet pricing, apply targeted pricing to specific vehicle types entering a zone, such as, you know, the Uber and Lyft or commercial vehicles. You can charge just those folks. Road user charges restricts access to a zone to vehicles enrolled in the road user charge program. You know, a lot of times they will do sort of odd and even license plate type stuff. So where odd license plates can go free on one day, and then even license plate can go free on the next day, or something like that. Arterial toll roads, basically price the entire arterial toll roads, express lanes and express roads. And then you could talk about parking pricing, on-street and off-street, you know, so maybe charging the pricing based on a variable price of parking based on the demand. And then you have the vehicle occupancy, hot lanes, where, you know, you let the occupancy folks go, like high occupancy vehicles go free, maybe two or more. We've had that, a lot of that in the Bay Area. I was just recently driving through during the Thanksgiving break on I-680. They're going to start that in the Bay Area very soon. So here are some case studies, and in Vancouver, Canada, right up the coast here on the West Coast. So they were experiencing problem with congestion, a lot of population growth, and tolling, and they had some equity and fairness concerns. So this is what they did. They created an independent pricing commission, which studied some alternatives, adopted goals that promote fairness in transportation costs and impact, and then connected. So they basically came up with two sort of policy potential alternatives. So they looked at all these different pricing options: fuel tax, distance rate charge, parking sales tax, parking public parking policy, vehicle levy, all these other parking policies. The course level evaluation, like if they will promote, if any of these tools here, are they going to promote, reduce congestion? Are they going to promote fairness? Are they going to support investment in the region? And then some other important considerations that they had. And based on that, they whittled down to two different ones. So they selected two of them: congestion point charges and then distance-based charges. So those were the two alternatives that they finally zeroed in on. Oops. So, and then how do you actually study the impacts? An example of studying their impact in the San Francisco Bay Bridge. Their road pricing strategy was hybrid between rationing and pricing. Traveler could use the bridge on some days without toll, but on other days only if they paid a toll. So what they figured was that the strategy would harm members of lowest income groups, and no combination of toll plus rationing rates was found to benefit all groups of travelers studied. So that was an issue when they studied that on the Bay Bridge. In Sioux Falls, South Dakota, they charge the road tolls. User with lowest value of time harvest the least benefit or suffer the most load. So again, you can see that some of these road pricing strategies, if you don't build in some kind of a back subsidy, what you see is that they're really harming the folks who are paying, who are in the lower income levels. So they are the folks who get most harmed by these kind of things sometimes, unless there is subsidy built in for those folks. So in England, the nationwide road user charging, including revenue raising and revenue neutral charging options. So if revenues from a national road pricing policy are recycled through a reduction in fuel tax, so benefits would accrue to more rural than to urban residents. So that's another. So it's not equitable. Maybe they didn't look at it from an equity, from a perspective of rich versus poor, but then there is that urban versus rural divide as well. So if you reduce the fuel tax, because urban areas are more congested, and so what they noticed was that the rural area folks who drive more traditionally, if there is a reduction in fuel, but they drive in more uncongested environments, so they get more benefits of reducing a reduction in the fuel tax. Road pricing impact study findings in Oregon: distance-based VMT charge. So this is basically whatever number of vehicle miles you travel, that's the amount of money that you will pay. So this is something interesting. So this distance-based VMT charge was the more equitable piece than existing gas taxes, because payments are more clearly related to benefits received. And then also that lower income folks drove fewer miles. So that was another interesting thing. And then on average, lower income folks drove fewer miles. So this was one study that found that if you are to actually do a distance-based VMT charge, you can derive the horizontal equity, where you're charging only the users for the infrastructure that they use, but then also at the same time, it's equitable for the lower income folks as well, because they tend to drive less. Okay, so then evaluating some of the funding options. How do you evaluate these things? So equity is one of the pieces of that. So you want to, when you're trying to evaluate these extra funding options, you want to look at the revenue potential. You want to look at the administrative burden. Could you enforce the charging mechanisms? efficiency impacts. So are you collecting tolls where people have to stop and pay the toll? What are the equity implications? Very important. And then public acceptance potential. Are people accepting of those types of charges? Are those charges politically too much of a hot potato? So equity consideration for funding options. So this is what you have to do. This is one way of doing equity analysis. So here are the key questions that you need to address. Will certain groups bear a disproportionate share of burden? Will members of some groups be adversely affected by a particular finance strategy? Or will revenue collected in one geographical area will be spent elsewhere? So that's another equity concern, is that. So that reduces this last piece. This last question is about horizontal equity not being followed, right? So it leads to less of a horizontal equity if that were to happen. So here's a little flow chart. Identify who, what, where is paying. Define equity outcome and performance indicators. We saw those indicators in the last module, so we can derive that. You'll need some data to be collected using maybe GIS related sources. And then you determine the benefits and burdens of people. And then choose programs that advance transportation equity. So once you determine benefits and burdens, you choose the program that places the least burden on the most vulnerable of the society. And then you adopt the program. And then you provide accountable feedback and evaluation. Okay, so this is one way of evaluating equity concerns for any kind of funding options that you might be testing out. Some additional consideration for funding options: increasing fuel tax, but you could see that Hawaii, California, Pennsylvania, these states already have a very high fuel tax burden. But the problem is, if you are relying on increased fuel tax, this might lead to decline in fuel consumption. And then, as we are seeing the electric vehicles sort of come on board, that might be a future, even more of an issue. Mileage-based fees, limited by several financial and administrative barriers, but again, because there might be privacy concerns, there might be, who gets access to what mileage data. So that's one concern. But as we saw in the Oregon study, that is one very equitable way. It kind of leads to most vulnerable portions of the society not paying as much money for their traveling. So because they don't drive as much. So this could be a good option. But again, there are some administrative barriers there that need to be accounted for. And then the general fund transfers, they require budget offsets elsewhere. So that's not very horizontally equitable, because you're taking the broader tax revenues and then using them to pay for the transportation infrastructure. So that's not horizontally very equitable. And the other question about so one thing I also want to highlight in the increasing fuel tax, the first one, is that you will see that because the initial cost of electric vehicles is high, right? So not only you expect a decline in revenue if you just have more reliance on fuel tax, you're reducing equity as well, because rich folks would be able to adapt to EVs sooner than poorer folks who might still be driving the gas engine cars. And then they will feel the brunt of the increased fuel taxes even more. So that's why increasing fuel taxes is probably not a very equitable way of raising transportation revenue. So one example of the Atlanta Regional Commission, what they're trying, maps the concentration of racial minorities, ethnic minorities, and low-income populations. So you can look at that region, most to least. So you can see more population is concentrated near the city, but as you go out in the suburbs, there are more affluent folks who live there. And then use this map to guide regional transportation land use planning investments. So make sure that when you look at the impact, you make sure that these regions are not impacted negatively. So this is one way of sort of that geographical data, geographical information systems, GIS data that I talked about. So this is how you can rely on where most of these traditionally underserved populations have lived. Another way of looking at it is the H+T index. H+T is the housing plus transportation index. So H+T index is how much percentage of your income are you spending on housing and transportation combined. Okay, so this is, you want to make sure that whatever scenario you are evaluating, okay, whatever scenario you're evaluating for different groups, so you can look at 38,000 household income, less than 38,000, more than 38,000. So that's sort of your threshold for separating lower income versus middle income groups. And you could see in the base year, you had the lower income household spending 72% of their income on housing and transportation. If you have no project, no build scenario, that percentage goes up to 80%. If you build a project, so this is one example EIR scenario, environmental impact report scenarios. So under the no impact scenarios, this is what would happen. That percentage will go up to 80%. So you can see housing percent goes 3%, transportation increases by 5%. Under the project scenario, that goes to 74%. And you can look at, you can look at these different sort of, scenarios, network of communities, transit priority, environmental equity, and jobs. So there are sort of these were sort of the different scenarios that they looked at. Okay, and we don't have to go into the details of that scenario. What I'm interested in is that we look at this HNT index and look for base year to project. You could see that if you just build that project, you see that overall, what's the increase? Okay, no project to project, or what's going on. And if you look at the same scenarios, you could look at it. You could look at the impact on the total of housing and transportation for the household greater than 38,000. You could look at similarly, and maybe you can pick out the project alternatives that lead to most benefits for the lower income households. Again, I'm not interested necessarily in the particulars of the numbers of each of these scenarios, but the broader principle of picking out projects that lead to most reduction in housing and transportation expenses, or least, because as you can see, that lower income household can spend as much as 3/4 of their income on housing and transportation. As far as, for household more than 30,000 a year, 38,000 a year, that percentage is only like 40%. So that's a big sort of equity issue, as how much of your income goes to these bare necessities of housing and transportation. You can look at the displacement risk. So displacement risk is if you're going to have high quality transit areas and areas within 500 feet of freeways and high traffic roads. So if you look at those, so those areas would become at the high risk of gentrification and displacement, because if you start building at those locations and the prices rise, then you will displace a lot of those, vulnerable populations from your areas. So you can look at areas within 500 feet of traffic and high traffic roads. So these are the purple sort of tracks there. Okay, so these are your regions for high traffic roads. High quality transit areas are blue ones. So this is where that is. And then because what happens is that if you have these high quality transit areas and you start building some luxury housing there, so those types of land use decisions can lead to displacement risk for folks. So another equity question that you have to consider when you're approving development. So what are some of the strategies that some of those agencies have adopted? So one of those examples is the MTC in the San Francisco Bay Area. They allocated 25% of the $3 billion anticipated revenue to benefit so the revenue schemes that they adopted, they made sure that the 25% is allocated um, to benefit the underserved communities, and then assist underserved communities in needs identification, and then you fund targeted investments that benefit those communities. So again, you can, even if you're sort of looking at some schemes that might not be equitable to begin with, you can allocate and dedicate a portion of that funding to the underserved community. So here are some strategies for addressing equity concerns. You determine where and how the revenues will be used. As I said, that you can dedicate 25% of the revenues. Incorporate equity analysis into project planning. You make sure you do that. Equity analysis would be, displacement risk, looking at, what's going to happen to the housing plus transportation, expenses for folks who are in the low income stratum. So you can incorporate those kind of questions in your analysis. You demonstrate the benefits through experimental programs and pilot strategies, and then you use a variety of public outreach and educational tools. So these are some of the strategies that can be used to address equity concerns. And then, it's difficult to anticipate how people will react to a proposed finance policy. So maybe ideas around assessing public opinion using pilot tests and public surveys would be useful. And anytime you have to package these things in, through pilot tests and public surveys, you have to figure out what's going to be the language that's most palatable, because even your best laid plans, if they don't get the political approval from the public, they might not be applied, they might not get deployed, those projects that you're thinking about. So it's very important that you assess public opinion, for your funding mechanism. So with that, I'm gonna stop this discussion. I think. So what's the big picture here from this module? The big picture is that the way we have traditionally funded transportation is fuel taxes, and fuel taxes are becoming inadequate because we just have less purchasing power for those fuel taxes, especially if you look at their purchasing power over time. We've kept the percentage the same, but we are driving more and more. And because of that, our fuel tax dollars don't go far enough. But there is another problem with the fuel tax measures. So even if you can increase the fuel tax, which is hard to do politically, but even if you could increase it, there is a problem. What's the problem? It's very inequitable, because higher income folks, they can afford the EVs. They drive more, but they could afford EVs, electric vehicles. So they don't pay their share of fuel taxes anymore. And poorer folks are expected to drive the ICE cars, the internal combustion engine cars, for a longer period of time, in the future. And they're going to be paying more in fuel taxes. So not only is it inadequate measure, fuel taxes, it's going to become more inequitable measure of funding. So we need to find new funding mechanisms. And among all these measures, the vehicle mile travel based measures are the most equitable. But the challenge there is that there is some administrative burdens. But I think the new technologies can solve that problem. I think we have now the technology to track vehicle miles and do it easily. We have these databases, we have the technology, the cloud computing and all that can enable it. But people will talk about the privacy concerns that they have around that. The big brother is watching type concerns, and that might pose problems. And it's difficult to anticipate how people will react to proposed financing policy. So one way of doing that is, obviously, you do the analysis, you look at the housing and transportation index, you look at where your vulnerable populations are and how those regions might be affected. So that's how you sort of test out different funding mechanisms. And then also, you can come up with the most fair, most fantastic financing schemes or tolling schemes and whatnot. But if you cannot get public approval for it, it will never get implemented. So you have to win on the ballot box or win politically the support of politicians who are in charge of these things. And for that, you might need some pilot tests, some public surveys, And I think we've seen that once people get used to the idea, they like it more. So the pilot test might be a good way of going about this stuff, because we saw that in another example in the class before. Okay, with that said, I would welcome any questions you might have about this. I'll pause and for a second and